Hi, Claire. How are you?
Hey, I am good. How are you?
I am good. As I was saying right before our countdown got to zero, I just have so many tangents. Anytime you're on the podcast, I like, we just say hi and then the chatting starts and it doesn't stop.
There's so much to talk about.
I know.
They have no
And not
idea.
enough time to talk about it. They have no
No one
idea
has
what we
any
had
idea.
for breakfast. Well, I will take us through last week's headlines because we have a lot to talk about today. But the main story that we're going to be discussing, and that's why we have Claire here, is her cover story from last week that I have been waiting for so long. I am so excited. I think it technically started out as my story, and then I was just like, I can't do it. And then you kind of were like, yeah, like I'm interested. And so we got to nerd out about it for a while as you were reporting, and then reading it and editing it last week was really fun. So we're going to dive into that. It's about the new HHS Dietary Guidelines, and we will... That's me and Claire's bread and butter. We love chatting about it. So that'll be a fun convo. Our second story was also incredible. Sarah put together a really cool story about kind of just checking in about where our Ukrainian oncologists are at in the context of sort of our scope, right? So obviously literal war going on. It's not something that we normally sort of, well, it is, but because of, it's not normally something we dip our toes in. It's not necessarily oncology focused, but because there are so many impacts on cancer patients and oncology in general, and the oncologists in this case, we definitely like to at least kind of bring our perspective to the issue. And in this case, Paul is actually a source on this story. So he is part of an organization that helps get Ukrainian oncologists observerships in the United States at cancer centers like Sidney Kimmel at Jefferson and Johns Hopkins as well. So definitely a really cool story. Sarah just kind of took it and ran with it. It was really fun just reading. It was just such a narrative piece in what could have been potentially like more of a bureaucratic piece. So it was very, very strong, really just enjoyable read. We had a guest editorial by Nicholas Richardson from Precision for Medicine. He used to be at FDA and he walks us through in incredible detail. And, you know, again, these bureaucratic documents, it's a draft guidance from FDA about using MRD for accelerated approval in multiple myeloma, which we covered the ODAC on last year. And that was a really interesting sort of discussion. There was, you know, we covered the story of the endpoint as it started at Sylvester. It was this whole narrative story. But this guest editorial really is more for developers and even, you know, maybe regulators. I'm sure regulators probably got it down, but for developers who want to understand this guidance and what it means for them. So that's a really, really helpful story, dense, but really, really helpful. And then our last story was a little bit odd, and I will kind of just let us lead into just our normal chat about our podcast with it. But it was a story by me and Paul. It was an editorial about the fact that we were nominated for the Webbies, which was, as I said in the voiceover last week, I was blown away and excited. And it was just it was a really cool thing to write because beyond just, you know, this excitement and, you know, we didn't expect this and it's so exciting. It was just cool to kind of take a look at what the cancer letter has become over time. And, you know, I've been here for less than 5 years, but still Paul has built this. I mean, it started as he says, what was it, 8 or 6 page newsletter. That was a whole thing when we were writing. We had to look up how many pages it was, but just a newsletter that was, you know, folded into envelopes and mailed out. And then of course there's this whole overhaul and, you know, the 2000s of going online, getting rid of the print side, but still having a really beautiful, like laid out PDF version. And now, you know, and there's so much to talk about. And I really honestly would love to hear you kind of wax poetic on this, Claire, because I feel like you would have some cool thoughts. But just in this world and this time where, you know, tweets are federal policy sometimes and the media is just changing so much, and it's changing, I feel, in this sort of analogous way to just media in general and like what we're covering and what the world looks like. So yeah, that was a really cool story. And also, of course, we're very excited to be nominated.
I'm just realizing that being on the podcast post-Webby nomination is a little different kind of pressure. I'll try to be cool.
Yeah, I know.
Like,
I know.
I should have prepped more. It's fine.
We'll get better. We'll, it's a learning process. We, as I've said a million times, it's only our first year. So, maybe prepping really well is in our future, but something's working. So maybe not.
True.
But yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts, Claire, not to put you on the spot, but I, especially being sort of more of the guest on a podcast, what that's been like for you. And yeah, also, we were not necessarily expecting to be podcasters.
Right. And I think also, even to back up a little bit further, when I joined, I've been here a little over a year and a half. I think we were still debating what to call the cancer letter. Like, I think magazine was kind of like a new concept. And I remember those early conversations and, feeling really proud to kind of be part of that transition from, I guess, whatever we considered ourselves prior to becoming a magazine. But it does feel very much like, those conversations, have been the definition of the cancer letter has been changing. And then in terms of being a guest on the podcast, well, my journalism journey started with audio. Actually, my first, my very first foray into any kind of journalism was with NPR, which is a little internship at my local NPR station. And I really loved writing for radio, and I really loved that whole process. And I applied to journalism schools on the assumption that I would be an audio journalist. And then I just realized that I was just a traditionalist and loved writing, and that's all I wanted to do was just write and not have to, put on lipstick, or not that I have to, but pink tax or whatever.
Yes,
we've talked about that.
Yes.
So this has been kind of a nice full circle thing for me to be able to be a guest on a podcast and to be able to talk about the stories that I'm reporting on. It's kind of a best of both worlds. So super exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like it's really nice to, this is sort of a thought in progress, I guess. So I might be sort of putting my foot in my mouth a little bit, but it's just interesting as we kind of move forward and sort of having a podcast and a magazine, like how our writing style changes if we're writing the podcast description, Claire. Like we talked about that last week. Like, headlines for a podcast have a very different tone and a very different almost goal than a headline for our magazine, where the only readers are going to be, MDs, PhDs, high-level administrators, nurses, like people who are really baked in this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's been a fun exercise as well. I feel just like, taking the same story and kind of just writing it and presenting it for different people has been really fun as well. Just as almost like an intellectual exercise, or
for sure.
I feel like I'm in school again almost sometimes.
Yeah. It's a good skill.
It is a good skill. Like I said, as the world gets more and more, as the attention span gets shorter, the literacy rates are declining. Don't need to necessarily go into that, but we'll keep up both old and new. We'll be there. The link is in our description. So when you get a chance, can you just cast a vote? And please remember to verify the vote in your email. It's a second step. It is annoying. Yes, I did it. Please, it's the only way your vote can count. Yeah, that's very fun. I just wanted to touch on that, but now we can get maybe into the meat of your story, Claire. No pressure to, do a perfect job. I will definitely be asking questions, but can you give us just sort of a rundown of maybe the elevator pitch of what your story was about?
Sure. So there's the new 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans were published in January of this year. Kennedy was kind of pre-tweeting about them, saying that these new guidelines are ending the war on saturated fat, and kind of immediately took off on this kind of public health tour, and has been promoting them. So I've been kind of watching that all fall out, along with the dietary guidelines. Kennedy has also resurrected a kind of a relic of the 90s, the food pyramid, which we know very well. I remember the food pyramid was printed out, and it was on my parents' pantry doors, and I would just look at it and be like, "What is this thing?" It was, I just never really fully understood. I remember that the very, very top had little dots, and I think they were supposed to represent kind of junk food and sugar.
Yeah.
That was retired in 2011, I believe, by Michelle Obama, and replaced with MyPlate. And the reason for that was because the pyramid was always a little bit confusing. It doesn't resemble a plate. And so the concept behind the plate was to kind of have something that you can visualize, something a little bit more simplified. And that has been the graphic that we've been using since. So bringing back the pyramid alone is kind of a big move, a big statement. And then I guess most notably is that he flipped it upside down. So it's an inverted pyramid, where, it's very much as opposed to the previous, pyramid where protein was kind of just a food group. Now protein is kind of the organizing factor of the entire pyramid. So you've got, visually, you've got in the upper my left hand corner, a big piece of red steak. And then you've got what looks like maybe an uncooked meatloaf. You've got a lot of full fat dairy products up there. And then fruits and vegetables at the top as well. So kind of completely inverted, the carbs there at the bottom. So yeah, a lot to dive into there. The oncologists, the dietitians that I spoke with, were happy in some ways that this kind of undergirds many years of settled science about plants and vegetables and fruits and vegetables and fiber, and then a little bit baffled by some of the other decisions that seem to kind of divulge from or diverge from scientific consensus. So, and then also just as a little bit more context, the dietary, I have to always look at the name, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee, the DGAC, is this advisory board. They've been working for 2 years to come up with the recommendations to support the DGA, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And about only half of those, that committee's guidelines were taken into account in the final DGA. And Kennedy actually put together his own group of kind of handpicked, nutrition, I guess, big food adjacent people, big dairy adjacent people, and came up with what oncologists are calling a shadow report, because they didn't know it existed until it was published. So that's a bit of a point of contention. So yeah, that's the story there. And I mean, I think it's important to point out that like the graphic, we can talk about the pyramid, which is fun to talk about, but it's also, it is just a graphic, and it's not, it's a little bit more sensational than what's actually in the guidelines.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, before we get, Paul will probably kill me, but I do want to get into sort of the nitty gritty of the guidelines. I feel like I'm really excited about it. But before we do that, I do think it's interesting just to talk about the graphic shortly, especially when you were telling me a little bit about like sort of what MyPlate offered to the American public that is really lost with I'm sorry, I'm looking at the graphic. I just didn't notice that there was an uncooked meatloaf until you said that. Yes. So that's really tickling me. Yeah,
it's fine. There's a couple of funny things on there. I'm not sure who designed it, but there's like an open yogurt, I think, and some kind of mystery oil. So
yes, not any seed oil. We know that.
No seed oils. Probably olive oil, probably EVOO.
Yes, of course. So yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about the MyPlate. I don't know if you're knowing what I'm getting at here. It's a leading question. So if I'm not doing a good job, I will circle back. But
yeah, I can try to. I think, I guess the health equity piece is assuming what you're teasing kind of. So MyPlate is really simple as a graphic, and it allows for substitutions. It allows for kind of diversification of ingredients, because it's just like 3 sections, I believe. It's not, I think one of the big criticisms with the pyramid and with the guidelines is it doesn't really take into consideration cultural sensitivities. It doesn't take into consideration that 75% of the global population is lactose intolerant. It kind of feels like a bit of this like panacea, wellness, kind of carnivore diet, and I read the guidelines and the final DGA, and, half of it does feel, like it's written by a nutrition. And then part of it does kind of feel like it's like some type of like ancestral eating kind of keto diet podcast.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's what you were asking about. I don't know a ton about the dietary guidelines that informed the MyPlate. I mean, I could try to talk about them based on my conversations that I've had, but it's not super fresh. But if you have specific questions, I can try to answer them.
Yeah, no, you got it. That's really where I was going at. And I think the point that has just really stuck in my head, and this is probably a good segue into maybe more what's like in the meat, if you will, of the guidelines. Yes, the protein of the guidelines is sort of this red meat question. Yeah. And I feel like that's And it's such a complicated sort of thing from an oncologist perspective. And just to give listeners sort of some background is that I came into this story thinking that it was going to be a follow-up on my story on the alcohol side of things. Yeah. So I was covering sort of the Surgeon General's report last year, the National Academy of Science and Medicine. I forget which one it was, or together. But they had a report that was sort of supposed to inform it. So we'll get into the alcohol piece, but I do just want to, these are kind of like open questions in oncology to a certain degree that we will get into more detail. I just want to like really heavily sort of hedge that. Yeah. However, my understanding, and again, this is maybe more from a lay perspective because I didn't do the reporting, is sort of this intense focus on red meat within sort of this intense focus on protein, and this idea that, maybe a big fillet would be good in certain situations, and maybe it's good for people who really need a carnivore diet for other conditions. Like, I don't know, but the red meat is maybe only good if you're getting grass-fed, organic, it's like, the health equity piece is cultural, like you were saying, but also I feel like maybe having access to high quality saturated fats and red meat and all of these other things. And I mean, that's an old story, of course. That's, getting access to quality food is always a challenge in the United States if you're in food desert, whatever. But I do.
And I think it's important to note like what the guidelines are for. Like most Americans don't read the guidelines, but they're super influential when it comes to determining what's served in school lunches, military bases and hospitals. And then it informs like federal food aid for moms and infants. They set, it sets targets for calories and nutrients. So they are, what's in there is really important, and access to those things also matters. I was talking with, Marion Newhouser, Dr. Newhouser from Fred Hutch about this, and what's this going to look like day to day in a school cafeteria, right? Like, I think the allocations for per child in a public school, at least in my area, is like $2.50, $3 maybe. And you can't even get like an organic avocado for that, so how it's going to actually, how it's going to pan out. And I just last week, when we included this at the end of the story, there was an CMS announcement about, these rules being implemented in hospitals. So we'll see how it plays out. But there, I think there's a lot of question marks around how this is actually going to work for Americans. And then, I think on one hand, just the whole protein thing, Christopher Gardner, my other really huge source on this, who was on the DGAC committee and teaches and professor at Stanford University. He pointed out that protein's it's not really a nutrient of concern. And that's in terms of both nutrition overall and in terms of cancer prevention, right? Fiber is the thing that we're really talking about right now. And that is de-emphasized. And it's kind of, it's interesting because on one hand, these dietary guidelines are super prescriptive, like eat more protein, embrace full fat dairy, like don't be afraid of animal fats like beef tallow and butter. And on the other hand, when it comes to alcohol, where cancer data are actually pretty consistent and pretty strong, we just get drink less, and Dr. Newhouser kind of pointed out that leaving out that daily limit for people, for men and for women, they've cut out that completely from these guidelines. That omission does send a message. And then, the de-emphasis of fiber is pretty huge in cancer prevention. So it's just interesting that we're being super, super specific where cancer is still debated, but pretty vague where it's been kind of settled, as you know. So it's kind of this like hierarchy of comfort almost. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really weird. And I mean, again, I'm coming to this just from what I, have personally like looked up before, so I'm not certain that this is like the most important, but I just, the red meat thing just really throws me off for some. And I mean, I think the alcohol thing, what you're saying about how it's like, they've definitely backtracked, and who knows what politics went on or not politics, like, who knows what's driving that decision on really. But like you're saying, that has an impact in that. And, so that's all there. But the red meat thing, for some reason, just really gets to me because, like, again, I don't know. we got to fact check me. This is a podcast, et cetera. But my brief research on it was that like processed red meat is a carcinogen. Like it is a carcinogen, like, you know, and I think maybe this gets back to sort of my issue with the stake in the in the pyramid is like, if you're going to really be pushing sort of this red meat and telling people not to be scared of it. And also the from my understanding, the jury's kind of still out on just regular red meat, like even like the highest quality, the nicest, the purest, all that. There's what I have seen is that there's sort of a split data on it. And again, haven't done like a lit review or anything, but so it's just a little bit concerning, I think, for me to say, like, you know, I love the idea. You're like, I want to be a wellness girl so bad. I really do. I love it. I love the aesthetic.
Yeah.
But it's just like, you know, if you're going to say, end the war on red meat, it's like, okay, but which are like, you know, when now you're encouraging people to, and then people feel good going and eating bacon when that causes stomach cancer. You know, it's like, it's just, so yeah, I guess that's my little soapbox that I realized.
It's a very similar take. I think that both myself, who is not, you know, was just reporting on this, and also experts are not happy about this. And it's a missed opportunity in cancer prevention messaging, especially at a time when there's a growing cancer burden, especially in colorectal cancer, early onset colorectal cancer. I feel like that was our entire issue last week, was just guest eds and ACS data on the growing cancer burden in young people. And as we know, a lot of that is assumed to be, you know, somewhat gut related. And I mean, so red meat, I believe, is a group 2A carcinogen, which means that it's a probable carcinogen. And then processed meats are a group 1 carcinogen. It's a strange one. And I think a lot of people don't quite know what to do with it. You know, why was some very settled science, a part of this and incorporated beautifully, and some of it was just completely ignored. Like, what's the agenda here? You know, it just feels like this very kind of one size fits all wellness perspective. You know, I mean, not that I want to get into these details, but kind of the lead of the story was this image of our health secretary in a blue lit grotto with Kid Rock, like chugging, I'm assuming raw milk. Like, it has to be raw cow's milk. You know, it's not oat milk. Okay. I think we know that. You know, just doing cold plunges and it just screams like access and kind of like this, it's just not all bad, you know, those are all lovely things, access to sauna and fitness, of course, but this just kind of like wellness grifting, I think is getting under experts' skin a little bit. So
yeah, I just think it's this really interesting moment where you have sort of this rising incidence of colorectal cancer, while a lot of other cancer prognoses are getting a lot better. There's a lot of hope in the oncology community, but also I feel like there's and I haven't ever tried to put this into words. I don't know. So I don't think so. Maybe just bear with me. But sort of, you know, Trump and Kennedy, and, you know, all of these sort of contrarian now leaders. I was going to include Prasad, but now he is not so much part of it. But yeah, like we have this new guard, and I think everybody knows how we kind of feel about it, what our stance is. But a reality that goes along with that is that they were brought in because they were anti-establishment, like the people that don't typically trust public health recommendations, for example. Like, this is the moment to catch them and help them with cancer prevention. And I think that's what makes me feel sad, is that, like, you know, RFK, like, I want to just believe that there are good intentions, and I'm not going to get into sort of like what could be going on, but hypothetically, he cares about health. He cares about, you know, like people getting exercise, ultimately, like all of these things, like you're saying, they're not bad. It's just that he's not thinking about the people who work 4 jobs part-time without healthcare and live in a food desert, you know? And I just, I think I'm just kind of repeating what you were saying, but I just, with this sort of transition away from sort of establishment, there was just such an opportunity, you know? And I just, I think I'm lamenting it a little bit.
I mean, and that's an important point that I forgot to mention, is that, you know, we both reached out to HHS on this subject, and then, you know, in the text of the Dietary Guidelines for America that were released, the rejection of the DGIC advisory committee's recommendations was based on the fact, well, one of the main reasons was because they believed that there was ideological bias and that the DGIC was viewing nutrition through a health equity lens, which, so that was what led to Kennedy kind of discrediting it ultimately and finding his own people. And that's sad. That's a really huge loss because if you're not looking at nutrition through a health equity lens, then you're not looking at nutrition for everyone. You're looking at nutrition for a one group of people who look a lot like you. So I think that is another just huge missed opportunity, but also not surprising. But yeah.
Yeah, we can hope. We can dream.
Yeah,
or I'll continue dreaming.
It's not all bad. I think it's just there's a lot of really good stuff in there, and I think finding the root. Food as medicine is not something that I'm opposed to. I don't think we're opposed to at the Cancer Letter, as long as it's evidence based. So good can come from this. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to? And again, maybe putting you on the spot, but I feel like we maybe haven't given enough. Or maybe you did, and I just wasn't. I was focusing on the other stuff, but maybe what did go well in the guidelines, just as a a nice way to wrap up.
Sure. So Christopher Gardner said that on the positive side, the guidelines do reaffirm several longstanding science-backed principles that nutrition experts broadly agree on, and those include eating more vegetables and fruits, choosing whole grains over refined grains, and limiting added sugars, sodium, and highly processed foods. So that is that's in agreement across the board. So that's good news. Yeah, because I think the old pyramid did have, that it had sugars in moderation. So this is kind of a resent of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's no more little dots at the top that people are going to be like, what does that mean?
Little sugar crystals.
Sugar. Maybe it's not going to stop me.
I never
knew. I well, thank you very much, Claire. This was a lovely chat. Yeah. I'm sure we will continue it offline as well. Yeah.
Over our bowls of granola.
And we'll follow the story. Yes. Fat-free Greek yogurt and high protein. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And see you next week,
Sounds
everyone
good.
else.
Thank you.